The interest to musicians of the late quartets is a new form of shorthand. We talk about the divine length of Schubert's symphonies, for example, the Ninth Symphony, for example, this wonderful divine length. We want this to go on forever. If we talk about Schubert's trio slow movements, for example, this incredibly long slow movements. We don't quite get that sort of massive length in Beethoven, in late Beethoven. They are long movements. But everything is done with a shorthand. There's almost like an encryption in the music. You never feel that time is ever present in the slow movements of the Beethoven quartets. It's absent. He gets to a point where time doesn't exist. He does this through very perfect devices. It's as if he's waited his whole compositional life to get to these pieces. There's just no, if you like, there's no fat around the edges on them. They're just perfectly crafted. There's nothing that needs not to be said in them. Everything that's said in it is in its perfect place. There's a simplicity in the works. They are quite intense works. Even in their quietest moments, there's this quiet intensity, quite unlike any other string quartets, still to this day. This quiet intensity, which draws the listener's ear into hugely. I think you do have to be in a reflective, and rather, there are those mystic moments in late Beethoven which are very, very important. I think you have to slow your heartbeat down if you can listen to them properly. I find a lot of them rather nocturnal works, if you like. They're works where one really, you certainly can't listen to it as wallpaper music, and it doesn't do very well for uplift music. It's the antithesis of lift music. It can't work at that level. One needs space to listen to these works. But once you do that, then sense of time goes. And in a sense, if you do go to listen to great works to understand something about time, I would say that the late quartets starts to answer that question. It answers that question, and in so doing draws in all the musicians. There will never be a classical music world, and certainly an instrumental world, that doesn't pay homage almost totally for the idea that these quartets exist. They contain just about every device. It's a lexicon of device to do with a tradition which spans back 400 and 500 years, but brought to an idea that it can be contained within 20 or 25 minutes. Now, I think that's pretty extraordinary.
Diabelli variations, probably the most enigmatic of all Beethoven compositions, and surely one of his most extraordinary outputs. Is unbelievable. They are dedicated to Antonia von Brentano, who probably is the immortal lover. We don't know, but she's the most possible candidate. And what is incredible in the Diabelli variations is the idea, is the new idea of variation. It's not an ornamental one. There is not a beautiful theme which is transformed, but there is a rough theme, a very vulgar one. It's a valser by Diabelli, who was a publisher, friend of Beethoven. Not exactly beautiful music. It's salon music and even a bit ugly, let's say. But what is incredible is that Beethoven takes this music not for its melodic or harmonic quality, but for its precise structure. So he has some basic elements which are not only transformed, are totally rethought piece by piece. So these are not variations in the traditional sense of the term. I mean, pieces which are gradual transformations of something you start with, but are 33 different objects, totally different, and all all the linkings to the theme are not textual linkings, but structural linkings. So, for example, it starts, the theme is this. Listen to the first variation, which is a march. It has nothing to do with the simple, straight valse which makes the theme. It's a totally different way of thinking the same musical elements. But the most amazing point of this fantastic cycle is the famous 20th variation, which is almost 100 years in advance. I mean, it seems a piece of the beginning of the 20th century instead of being of 1822. This is.
Well, the Royal Philharmonic Society is still going, is coming up to its 200th anniversary in 2013. From that, you can work out that it was founded in 1813 as a group of professional musicians in London for the furtherance of music and the development of contemporary music in those days. And they formed an orchestra, and one of their earliest interests was in the music and the personality of Beethoven, and the Society gave many of the first British performances of major Beethoven works, the 5th and 7th symphonies and 3 of the piano concertos, and they tried for some time to get him to come to London and to write 2 symphonies for the Society and to direct them, but I think his health, his hearing was so far gone that anyway the project never came to anything. But the Society then pursued Beethoven further and sent him a cheque for 50 guineas to commission a symphony, and that worked, and the result of that commission was Beethoven's 9th Symphony, the Great Choral Symphony, which is a pretty good commission for a society to start with.
It's amazing if you look at Opus 28, the sonata, which is also called the Pastorale, what a merry and joyful piece it is, and yet it's composed at the same time that he wrote the Heiligenstädter Testament. So it's amazing to see a composer who is in such deep anguish and misery, threatening to kill himself, and yet he comes out with something beautiful as this. It's a sort of therapeutic sonata almost to show the world that although he's in dire straits, that his art goes on, and this is what's keeping him alive.
I do think that the name Appassionata is a very well chosen one. I don't know who thought of it. I don't know when it was first actually used, but I think it's certainly more than appropriate. It's very descriptive and very well chosen. It's a piece of great passion. Well, I think probably it's an incredible study in contrast and also in attaining a goal. In a certain sense, it has something in common with the Fifth Symphony, in that musically speaking, what you're really doing in the first movement is you're kind of heading from the dominant to the tonic. You can basically describe the entire piece, the entire first movement, as doing this, which is kind of short for an 11-minute movement or whatever it is. But you can hear when you start, and we're back on the dominant again, even though we know we're in F minor, because we've heard the whole F minor chord outlined. Then we switch over to just a half a step up, big shock, very weird. But same pattern, we're still sorry about the wrong notes, but the point is, we keep heading to this note, to this note, to this note, which will eventually want to go here. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. That's, I guess, if you have this chord, our ear, or at least the ear of his listeners, would certainly tell us, okay, finish this somehow. You know, because this is not a good end. So do something, do that. And this pattern, going through all the stuff that's happening in the first movement, keeps repeating and repeating and repeating, and finally, the very end of the piece, we're still there, and then just before the coda, the really fast ending part, he finally goes, he's finally done, instead of doing this, he's finally gone. Right? So what you're really, I know it's a kind of long thing to reduce to nothing, but I think you could almost say that this journey is really the journey of the dominant to the tonic, going through every possible permutation. But I think that's what makes it so powerful and so driving and so passionate, because you're always looking for this resolution. And when you finally get it, when you finally get this is the first movement and you're still not relaxed, in fact, because he's put this little tag on the end of the big arrival to make it all disquieting all over again.
And then he comes with this also a rather simple tune, but also very beautiful. This da, 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 da. The piano continues. Ya, da, 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 da. That's the piano. And then a highly virtuoso movement starts, especially at the piano. I mean, he has tons of runs and triplets going all over the place. And the cello is kind of struggling to fight against, because it plays the same important role. We have lots of fortissimo, and it's a very long movement. He puts 2 big repeats, and I'm not a huge fan of repeating for too long, but this movement demands it. It goes really crazy. It already feels as if there's this old man with all his problems, turning deaf, and all these things almost seem to be anticipated in that sonata. It reflects like a life full of craziness and suffering, and yeah, probably that's why I love this piece, love to play it, and especially this first movement. And I remember the very first time I played the G minor sonata, that was when I also did for the first time all the Beethoven sonatas. And I had learned the last one, the G minor, the last one for me, just a couple of days before the concert by heart. I had played it before, but practiced it before, but not learned by heart. And in the concert, I had to focus so much to keep all the notes together that, especially in that movement, in the first movement of the Opus 5 number 2, I got so carried away, and it felt so strong. It's a very strong piece. We have these... This comes so oft. And with a repeat, it comes like 6, 7, 8 times. This angry start of the piano with triplets and us responding. And I hope we played it quite well and strong. So the very end of the movement again comes to a still stand. There's like a little choral. And then the last bars, like and I was so into this incredibly strong and powerful feeling that with the last note, I stood up. I don't know why. I'm not a person of great gesture when playing, but it felt so complete, this first movement, that I stood up to take a bow. But there was no bow to give because there was a second movement to follow. So I stood there, and I remember it was radio live transmission, and it was in Germany, and the people were very disciplined, so nobody clapped. I just heard this. I sensed them smiling, and I couldn't even cover up like, oh, I had to like sit better. No, I was obviously standing to take a bow, and I probably smiled very stupidly and sat back down to start the next movement.
Beethoven's music is audibly and visibly a struggle because he couldn't write any other kind of music. It was in his nature. I mean, life was difficult for him. it takes us out of our comfort zone in a sense. You know, when you have to imagine the difficulty of getting to one part of the instrument to the other, it has almost a direct emotional correlation in a sense. He wasn't concerned about the physical convenience, the instrumental convenience of his music. It is not supposed to sound easy, but with Beethoven I think it's very often supposed to sound challenging. You have to, the sense of struggle is part of the DNA of the music.
In the 18th century, there were well-known traditions about how fast music should be played, and a lot of these speeds were related to dances. So much music was dance-based. People knew the dances, and therefore they knew the speed to take the music. All musicians in Vienna played for dance. There were Italian words because a lot of musical ideas came from Italy. Allegro meant cheerful, and andante meant moving along, adagio meant broadly, lento meant slowly, presto meant fast.
I have long been thinking of abandoning those absurd descriptive terms, allegro, andante, adagio, presto. And Maisel's metronome affords us the best opportunity of doing so.
Beethoven was lucky, and very lucky for us, that he met the man who created the modern metronome, Mälzel, of Dutch origin, I guess. What was good about it was that you could vary the speed with this sort of check on the handle. You move it further up and it went slower. Top, top, top. And Beethoven was frightfully thrilled with this. He got an early model, he bought it, or Mälzel gave him one, and he thought, this is it. Now that music's changing, in particular now that music's changing, I'll put metronome marks against all my music and people will know. And he wrote, only by the metronome will people know about how to play my music in the future.
The problem when we get to the 29th Sonata, Opus 106, the Hammerklavier, is that Beethoven has written his own metronome markings in the piece. That he's exactly written down how many beats there are in 1 minute. So that gives a very accurate idea of the tempo he wanted. The only problem there is that the metronome mark in the first movement, which is 138 half bars in 1 minute, it's so extremely high that it's basically impossible to play the piece at that tempo. And for a long time, people have always thought that it's been a misprint or a mistake from Beethoven's side. I actually have this idea that a composer, apart from writing down the exact tempo of a piece, that a metronome mark can also mean a sort of degree of intention, of energy. And I think Beethoven, when he thought of this first movement, he just thought of the first 4 bars, which are full of energy, and that's about 138. The problem is, if you continue in that tempo, it all starts feeling like a sort of comedy caper melody or something out of a Benny Hill show. I think his idea was the first bars have to have this tremendous energy. It's one of these sonatas where it's very clear that Beethoven was struggling with his material, with this sonata, but probably also with life in general.
And then what follows are variations that seem to go deeper and deeper into the rhythmical structure, and it seems as if he tries to understand what is the secret of this immense beauty. I want to keep that moment. How can I keep it this moment? How can I get deeper to the bottom of it, to the ground of it? And then in the following variations, this is getting more and more complex and more rhythmically. The units get smaller and smaller. It's like a rational attempt to get to understand that secret. This seems like he's gone from this unit of 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, then he went to 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and then the unit gets smaller, ding, da, 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 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and you're thinking, okay, it can't get any smaller than that. But then he gets to this rhythmical ecstasy of the next variation, which seems like he's completely obsessed by this idea of getting more and more minuscule. It's like looking through a microscope and only seeing a little detail of what's been going on.